Okay, so here we go with our first lecture in Earth Science, and we're going to introduce the topic today and talk about a few other things. So, Earth Science it's a very, very broad group of sciences. There are multiple disciplines within it, but it's the name for all of the disciplines that try to study the Earth and its neighbors in space. Astronomy is one of the Earth sciences. So Earth is a planet. There are many other planets. We can apply what we know to Earth to them, and we can perhaps apply discoveries on those planets to Earth as well. So it's a collection of many different disciplines. The first one, and the broadest out of all of them probably, is geology. The majority of this class is geology. It's studying the solid body of the Earth. So rocks and minerals, but also earthquakes, volcanoes, plate tectonics, fossils are part of geology. If it's got to do with rocks, dirt, the ground, whatever, it's geology. Even studying like natural resources, the fossil fuels and metals that we dig out of the ground, that's geology. Oceanography is the study of the chemistry, the physics, geology, and the biology of the oceans. Oceans have huge influences over climate as well, so it's not just what's in the water, it's what the effects of that are. And then that kind of takes us to meteorology, the study of atmosphere and the processes that shape both weather and climate. Now, weather and climate are two very, very different things. We'll get into that when we get there, I suppose. And then lastly, astronomy, the study of the universe. That's pretty vague too. We will spend most of our time looking at our own solar system, and then we'll try to look at the rest of the universe, see what's out there. So when we think of geology, like I said earlier, it's very broad. Here we can look at, patterns of erosion, what creates these rock formations. We can see we have all different color bands here, all orientated in different ways as well. That would be plate tectonics a little bit. We can see that same thing here. If you look at this rock formation, it's folded in half, like a taco or something. What could have done that to solid rock? Well, we'll get there. Just more rock formations. And then Earth's interior is part of geology too. So we'll talk about the mechanisms beneath the Earth's crust, volcanoes and plate tectonics and all that kind of good stuff. Oceanography, so we'll look at waves and ocean currents and how they affect the biology of the ocean, how they affect us as well, how they move weather around, and then some features that go on with like erosion and weathering and stuff at the surface too. Weather, pretty self-explanatory. We will talk about hurricanes and different kinds of storms, all the different kinds of precipitation, but then climate is very different because climate is the sort of average weather over a very long period of time over a very large area. And then astronomy, the universe. We'll talk about how planets are formed. That's what this is trying to show us. We'll actually talk about today a little bit about how Earth formed. Here's a galaxy. This is a star. We'll spend actually a lot of time on the characteristics of stars. We'll take a look at the other planets, and there we see a comet. So we'll look at the other members of our solar system. Okay, so where we're going to begin is, where does our planet come from? So Earth is one of many planets that revolve around a particular star. We call it the sun. And those objects all formed at pretty much the exact same time. Before there was an Earth, there was no sun. There were stars in other places in the galaxy, but in this particular spot, there wasn't one. They formed at the same time. And we call this the nebular hypothesis. So a nebula is it's kind of like a cloud of powderized matter. That you think of it like chalk dust. It's not a gas, it's solid stuff, but it's broken down incredibly fine and it's just dispersed over a huge area. Nebulas are incredibly large. There are several light years across in most cases, and a light year is just a phenomenal distance. that nebula contains all of the elements you can find in nature, all the elements you can find on Earth, which there are 92 naturally occurring ones, all the way from hydrogen to uranium. But a nebula is made around 98% or so of just hydrogen and helium. That's it. So Earth has no hydrogen on it really at all, unless we make it in a lab. And Earth has almost no helium on it either. Most of our planet is iron and rocks and minerals and things like that. So where is all of this hydrogen and helium? Well, for the most part, it's in the sun. The sun contains 99.85% of all the matter in our solar system. So that's a huge number. You take all the giant planets, even like Jupiter, they still only make up 0.15% of everything else besides the sun. So if this table demonstrates if the entire universe weighed 2,000 pounds, so not quite a ton, but close to that, what would be the weight of everything and the percentages? Well, 98% of it, boom, there you go, hydrogen and helium, with hydrogen being about 3 times more common than helium. The next most common element is oxygen. Next is carbon. Neon is next, and then nitrogen. But you combine those together, and that makes up only 1% of everything else. The next most common, magnesium, silicon, iron, they make up only 0.4%. And then the 74 remaining elements only make up 0.6% of what's out there. So 74 out of 92 elements, so something like, 85% of all the types of matter that are out there, only make up 0.6% of our universe. It's kind of fascinating. All right. So what happens is this nebula, I have a picture of one that I'll show you in a little while. But over time, gravity causes the nebula to collapse. It starts off as a cloud, but that cloud rotates, and it rotates in a particular direction. So like pizza crust, if you toss that over your head, it gradually flattens the thing out. So it starts to go to a plane or a thin disk. And all of those particles that make it up start to collide, and they collect together, and it's called accretion. You can think of it like building a snowman or something. You start off with this big plane of snow in your yard or whatever, and you can start with just a tiny little snowball, and you roll it over all that matter, and you collect it, and eventually you could theoretically collect all of the material that's there, and it would all be localized in this one giant body. That's what our solar system did. The majority of that stuff became our sun, and then the more than 99% of what was left turned into the planets, and then everything that wasn't collected makes up our asteroid belt, comets, and just random stuff floating out there. So this is a real picture from the Hubble telescope. A little bit of photoshopping's been done to colorize it. But this is what a nebula looks like. So it's just kind of a cloud floating out in space. And again, the distance from one side to the other of this thing they're usually at least a light year across. So they're just gigantic. So these are simulations, but over time that nebula starts to rotate, and you can see now that it's sort of been flattened. It's now like a pizza or a pancake, going around either clockwise or counterclockwise. And we can see all that pressure from all the material cramming into the center starts forming a sun. Now in this picture, a little bit further in the evolution of the thing, we can see some solid bodies. There are tons of them. Eventually, most of them collect together. So where the Earth was orbiting the sun, there would have been dozens of objects, maybe close to the size of the moon, but eventually they kind of crashed into each other and all formed into one body. And that would be the case for pretty much where all of the planets are. So this just keeps going on and on and on, and eventually we get to the mature solar system. Now, this whole process, we believe, takes around 100 million years to accomplish. When did our solar system begin to form? A little more than 4.6 billion years ago. A really, really, really incredibly long time. I don't have any pictures, but we have actually seen nebula out there in the Milky Way with the Hubble telescope. So we've seen this process happen. Now obviously we could point that telescope at the nebula for 10,000 years and not much would change. It's a slow process. Like I said, we think it takes 100 million years for all that debris to collect into planets. Okay, so after you get an Earth, something else really important happens. Earth was totally molten for many, many millions of years after it formed, so it didn't have a solid surface. The entire thing, you can think of it, a giant planet-sized ball of lava. What kept it that way for a long time was, first of all, radioactive elements. Things that are radioactive give off a lot of heat as they decay, and Earth's interior is full of radioactive elements. That's what helps keep our mantle still in a partly molten state. But also, Earth would have been bombarded for many millions of years after it got to virtually 99.9% its current size. Earth still would have been bombarded hundreds of thousands of times per second by asteroid impacts. So that would have kept melting the surface, because those asteroids are traveling at speeds like 15 miles per second, and they liquefy anything that they hit. So what happens is, now Earth is made of all kinds of different materials. There's gases like nitrogen and oxygen in our atmosphere. There's water that sits on the surface. There's heavier rocks and minerals below that. And then there's even more dense, even more dense metals in Earth's interior. Well, what happens with materials when you mix them, like in a liquid medium? The more dense material sinks, and the lighter material, the less dense material, floats. That's called differentiation. So the lighter rocks, like granite and things like that, water, vapor, and other gases, floated or boiled their way to the surface, and they still sit there today. Metals and the heavier elements, the rare stuff, that sank to the core of the planet. So we can mine gold and uranium and other very heavy elements close to Earth's surface, but those things are way more concentrated deep below the mantle. Now we can't go down there, but we would find way more of it there. So this kind of just models what's going on. When a planet, and these really aren't drawn to scale very well, when a protoplanet, we can call it, when it's still a lot smaller than the moon, it doesn't have enough gravity to shape itself round, and it doesn't have enough mass, and its interior isn't full of enough radioactive material to keep itself molten. So our moon, for example, does not have a liquid core and a partially molten interior. It's too small. It's cooled all the way through. But Earth is many, many times larger than the moon, so it has a bank of all that radioactive stuff in its interior, and that has kept our planet molten in the inside for over 4.5 billion years. This is something you could do at home if you wanted to tinker with it. So these are just different liquids, and if you pour them in one at a time, really slowly, really carefully, they differentiate. So honey is more dense than corn syrup, so they don't mix, but corn syrup is more dense than maple syrup. And then milk, soap, water, and then random oils. You've probably seen like rubbing alcohol or oil, maybe like gasoline mixed with water. It always floats on top, so there you go. And then they dropped some random everyday objects in there with it. Okay, part 2. So we're going to look at kind of the structure of the Earth, mostly on its surface, in just the broadest way we possibly can. So Earth is divided into these physical domains, and we call them spheres, and each of them is where we develop one of those different sciences. The first is, it doesn't matter, but we'll go the hydrosphere first. So that is all of the water on Earth, both liquid water and frozen water. So this is where we get our oceanography studies from, but lots of others too, because we would study rivers with this. We would study lakes with this. And then the frozen portions. Sometimes we call that the cryosphere. Now, why the heck would we study the cryosphere? Well, Earth has a balance of, there's lots and lots of ice locked on land in Greenland and Antarctica. And for a long time, that's sort of been stable, but now as the planet's been warming in the last several decades, there's an imbalance. Now more water melts, or more ice melts from Greenland and dumps into the oceans every year than is formed on its surface. For as long as we know, going back at least many thousands of years, there's always been a balance, or there's been more ice on Greenland than melts every year, but that's not the case anymore. So the cryosphere is an important branch. The vast majority of all water is in the oceans. I'm sure you knew that. So water is important because, like I said earlier, ocean currents shape climate. They're hugely influential in that. But water's properties they have huge influences on life on Earth. The fact that water floats when it solidifies or freezes, that's totally unique. If that weren't the case, then a lake would have its ice sink to the bottom, and that would choke out all the things that live there. And living things require water to live, obviously, so we will focus on pollution, both on land and in the oceans. We'll focus on our use of water, pumping it out of the ground for irrigation. How do we balance that? Because eventually we could exhaust all of that water, and then we can't grow food anymore. And then what the heck do you do with 7.5 billion people when you can't feed them? And, water's the most common compound in all living things. No matter if it's a plant, a fungi, a unicellular organism, or a multi-celled animal, all those things are the majority made up of water. So here's just the water cycle. I don't think I need to bore you with that. If we break down the water, so only 3% of it is fresh water. 2/3 of that 3% is frozen, so it's not really accessible by us. And virtually the rest of it is underground. So lakes and streams, yeah, they're gigantic, but there's so much water underground and frozen. All right, next, the atmosphere. So call this like a thin, tenuous blanket of air. It's a mixture of several different things, although over 99% of it is just three different gases. Nitrogen, which makes up about close to 80%, closer to 78%. Oxygen is close to 20%, and then argon is right around 1%. So I know that equals 101%, but these are approximations. It's a little bit less than 80, it's a little bit less than 20, and this is actually a little bit more than 1. There are some others. There's methane, there's carbon dioxide, there's ozone, but those make up like 0.000 something percent of our atmosphere. They're really, really small. So we obviously need oxygen to breathe. Plants need carbon in order to sort of breathe. That's the gas that they take in. But the atmosphere also shields us from UV radiation, which the sun would cause cancer in our cells. It would mutate the DNA in our cells rapidly if we didn't have an ozone layer. Decades ago, it was discovered there's a huge hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica. Most of that has closed up now, which is lucky. But Australia, which is down in the southern hemisphere, there are actually parts of Australia where there's a hole in the ozone layer, and it's pretty much in the outback desert, but you can't go out there because the odds of you getting a sunburn that would cause you to have melanoma later in life are so extremely high that it's almost like a radioactive zone, like a do not enter, like a Chernobyl or something like that. And also, the atmosphere is what gives us weather, and the Earth needs weather to break compounds apart and reshape the surface to make life possible, and it traps warmth. Earth is kind of in this Goldilocks zone, a decent distance away from the sun where it's not too hot, not too cold. But you need an atmosphere for that to work. You can demonstrate that by looking at the moon. The moon is just as far away from the Earth just as far away from the sun as the Earth is, but there's no atmosphere on the moon. So the daylight side of the moon facing the sun, because there's no block or protection from the UV light, it gets up to more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit on that side of the moon. And then when you go to the other side, when you're on the dark side of the moon, because there's no atmosphere to trap warmth like a blanket, it can get close to negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit over there. So Earth is very stable, the temperatures, the moon not at all. The atmosphere actually goes around 100 kilometers into space, but 90% of the molecules that make it up are in just the bottom 16 kilometers. Oops. This I kind of already said, energy drives weather, but this is the most rapidly changing and vulnerable part of our Earth. It changes by the minute, by the hour, as far as weather goes, but long-term climate changes it can change very radically in a matter of only decades or centuries, which in geologic time, that's the blink of an eye. Because remember, the Earth is billions of years old. Think about the dinosaurs. They were around dozens of millions of years ago. So a few thousand years for the climate to shift is really nothing. And it can be polluted and influenced by human activity very rapidly as well. So there it is, the blue fuzz that you see on the outside of our planet from space is our atmosphere. And here's a graph of what makes it up. So you can see nitrogen about 78%, oxygen actually about 21%. There's argon, so I was wrong, it's a little less than 1%. And then all the rest of them make up just a tiny 0.04% combined. There you go. I don't want to look at that. Here's a graphic that just kind of demonstrates how the atmosphere is concentrated way down here, and it gets very, very thin as you go up. You've maybe heard like people that climb very tall mountains like Everest have to have oxygen masks because, their lungs work just fine, but way up there, I will go back to that picture. At the summit of Mount Everest right here, let's see here, 1,000. So at the summit of Mount Everest, there's only about 30%, because it's 30 or 300 out of 1,200. Yeah, out of 1,000, sorry. So there's only about 30% the oxygen, or air. There's only 30% of all the gases up there. So each breath, you're only taking in a third as much oxygen, while trying to lug around a lot of gear and keep your body warm and all that other stuff. Okay, the geosphere. That is just Earth. So if you could strip away all the air and water from Earth's surface, all we have is the geosphere. There you go. Because it's differentiated, we break it up into these layers, and those layers are based on composition. So we have a crust that's made mostly of silicate minerals that have silicon and oxygen atoms in them. The mantle is made of mostly these minerals called peridotite, and the core is actually iron and nickel. So it's metal because the heavy material sinks. The dense material sinks to the middle. So there's sort of a cutaway of the Earth. You've probably seen that before. Earlier we looked at what's the composition like of the universe. Well, here's the Earth, because it's very different. Most of the Earth, more than a third of it, is iron. Now, more than 99% of that iron is just in the core, so it's inaccessible to us, but luckily there's so much of it on the surface that we don't have to worry about running out of that. Oxygen is next, but that's not oxygen gas. It's oxygen bonded to other things, like minerals, like quartz, the crystal clear mineral, that has oxygen atoms in it. Similarly, probably a lot of that iron is bonded to other things too. Magnesium is next, then silicon, sulfur, nickel, calcium, aluminum, and everything else just 0.6%. So there we go. And this just tells you what makes up those different layers. What about you? So I thought this would be kind of interesting. You are mostly oxygen, 65% oxygen. Now again, it's not oxygen gas. Most of the oxygen that makes up your body is bonded to water, so, H2O. Carbon is next, then hydrogen, 10%, nitrogen. So what's really fascinating is, I think it's like 95 or 96% of your body is just these four elements right here. You're almost entirely made up of just those things. Now, these other things, even though they're in tiny, tiny quantities, you can't live without them. If we just took all the magnesium out of your body, even though it's only 0.1% of your body, you wouldn't really lose any weight. But you'd die instantly from that. So these things that's why you need to eat your vitamins. The crust it's dynamic and it changes. We have plate tectonics. A long time ago, around 250 million years ago, up until about 180 million years ago, all the continents were joined into one supercontinent. We call that Pangaea. It's broken apart since then. Now, the crust does that at a really slow rate. So we've gone from one continent to 7, and that's taken, about 150 million years. That's a long time, but really not to the Earth. That cycle could have happened 30, 40 times over since the Earth formed, closer to 30. Besides plate tectonics, breaking up and moving the surface around, weathering and erosion are the things that sculpt mountain chains, canyons like the Grand Canyon and others like that. So it's not exactly the crust that moves around. It's something called the lithosphere, which is the crust and part of the mantle, just part of it. And that moves over a layer called the asthenosphere. So that's just the molten other top layer of the mantle. Here are the plates, so just kind of break them down, look at a map of them. We have a whole chapter on this, so we're not going to spend a ton of time looking at it. But this model just kind of shows how in some places Earth's crust is splitting apart. So look at the Atlantic Ocean. It gets bigger every single year. Our distance from Europe and Africa gets wider every year by about 5 centimeters, not very far. Other plates, so if some are splitting apart, others are crashing into each other. So if you look at a map of North America, which we'll go back here, North and South America, it's nothing but mountain chains all the way from here. We have the Alaska Range, the Rockies, and the Andes Mountains. And that's because these plates are crashing into each other, and as they do that, it lifts up the crust. So there are some parts of Earth where there are two land masses that are coming together. All right. So this is not biology, so we really don't have a chapter on the biosphere, but that's just all the environments that contain life, deep under the oceans, up in the air, and then on pretty much all the surfaces we can find at least single-celled life. We're making more and more really radical discoveries with life. Just in the last couple years, we have gathered rocks that have either been drilled or erupted from like mud volcanoes from several miles below the ocean crust. So locked inside of basically solid rock, inside of miles deep solid rock. And when that material comes to the surface, we still find living things in it. They're bacteria, or archaea, maybe, but there's still life down there. So it's really changing our perceptions of how life can emerge in different places. But we're part of the biosphere, so and obviously we need agriculture to survive, and agriculture is just the controlling of certain parts of the biosphere. So we will, as often times as we can, talk about how interactions on Earth's surface and everything influences the biosphere and influences us, or perhaps how we influence it, both positively and negatively, mostly negatively. I have talked about this already, so you can just read through this, but the Earth's surface changes. So we have constructive forces. So where plates are pulling apart, that is creating a brand new surface every time that happens, constantly. So that's a constructive force. Volcanoes, too. This summer, there have been the crazy eruptions in Hawaii. So that's unfortunate for some people, but that's how that entire mountain was built. Many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years ago, Hawaii was, it didn't even exist. It was just a simple mound of some lava on the bottom of the ocean. That stuff piles on top of itself over and over again until it breaches the surface of the ocean, and now it's a habitat where people and other things can live. So that's constructive. Destructive would be like weathering and erosion, or when plates collide and one of the plates inevitably has to sink back into the mantle. Okie dokie. And here's just a progression of the land masses breaking up. So again, just to reiterate, plate tectonics is actually pretty new science. It was first, something like plate tectonics was first hypothesized in the very early 1900s, and it was rejected pretty much because we didn't have any good physical evidence. So we had no idea how earthquakes worked or how the land masses could have split apart until only like 50 years ago. So that's pretty new in terms of sciences. Whoa, what happened? Okay, we're back on. But it just demonstrates that Earth's outermost solid surface, because the Earth basically only has one solid part, well, it has two solid parts. The outside layer, and then the very inner part of the core is solid. The rest of the planet is sort of like molten or very soft. So that outer shell is broken up, it moves around. There we go. It doesn't stay still. All right, looks like that's the end.